Peter Hitchens is a veteran journalist and foreign correspondent who started out as a Trotskyist writing for the Socialist Worker and became an arch-conservative and currently a columnist for the Mail on Sunday. Go figure. His late brother Christopher, of course, took a different route. I spoke to Professor Nicholas Boyle last week, and he was saying that the vote to leave the European Union was the impulse of an England in the throes of an identity crisis. Well, Peter Hitchens has argued for Britain to leave the European Union for years. I suggested that the current disarray about Brexit in Britain might be a case of the gods punishing him by answering his prayers.
I was wondering that the other day myself, because I didn't wish for it in this form or ever actually think that it would happen. And I certainly didn't want a referendum or take any part in it. But I have for a very long time wanted my country to be independent again, which was my main concern.
When you say your country, you mean Britain or England?
I mean what is nowadays called the UK, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, the country I grew up in. That is the one I want to be independent. I've tended to feel that the increasing breakup of it has been caused by our membership of the European Union and is a side effect of it.
And by the breakup of it, you mean the Scottish Assembly and the Irish?
Well, I don't mind having a Scottish Assembly at all. There's a lot of sense to having a Scottish and Welsh Assembly. What I do mind is the national implication of it, the feeling that it's the stepping stone to what some people regard as independence, and I regard as a different kind of vassalage. Scotland would simply change if it did achieve independence from being a vassal of London to being a vassal of Brussels, which doesn't seem to be much of a step for them. But I think that there's nothing wrong with a lot of self-government, and I can quite see the case for having a Scottish Parliament, but I don't want it to be the precursor of an actual breakup of the United Kingdom, which many nationalists want it to be.
Why do you think the EU membership has been responsible for that?
Well, because the European Union encourages the idea of limited sovereignty and of semi-nations. And Britain has become a semi-nation while it's been a member of the European Union. This goes right the way back to Richard von Kuhlmann, the German Chancellor at the end of the First World War, who was very interested in creating semi-nationalisms, particularly in Eastern Europe, in the former domains of the Russian Empire, to put a bomb under the Russian Empire by giving the former nations the semblance of independence, and therefore encouraging them to believe that under German tutelage they would have a lot more than they had under the Russians. And I think the European Union, for most of its members, is limited sovereignty, the semblance of nationhood without the reality. And within that, of course, once you no longer have the ultimate responsibilities of foreign policy and trade and defence and currency and all the rest of it, you can have a flag and a parliament and all kinds of symbols of nationhood. And you can consider yourself a nation when you're not really. And Britain shrank into that role, and Scotland grew into it.
But what about the argument that, I mean, you've cited Lord Heseltine as saying the nation states have had their day as power.
He said it.
And the argument is that nation states have been responsible for war. And if you remove that kind of nationalism, then you have peace on earth.
I think it's a good argument for continental Europe, because a particular nation state, that is to say post-Bismarck Germany, has certainly been responsible for a lot of wars. And you could say that the Franco-German conflict, which developed really after Napoleon, was responsible for a lot of wars. And
so you're arguing for British exceptionalism then, are you?
Well, I'm not arguing for it. I'm stating it as a fact. Britain has been separate from all of this. Britain stayed out of the Franco-Prussian War and would have been a lot better off if it had stayed out of the Russo-German War of 1914 as well, but it foolishly plunged into it and thus changed history for the worse. But it is exceptional in many, many ways. It hasn't been invaded since 1066. It has common law instead of instead of civil code. It is wholly differently governed and has a completely different history, and largely created by the fact that it's surrounded by deep salt water. And it's not a question of arguing that it's exceptional. It's a question of saying it is exceptional. Should it, under those circumstances, conform to a system of government devised for other sorts of country? And I think probably not.
If you think that entering into Europe was always a bad idea, why did we do it?
Well, you don't call it Europe, call it the European Union or whatever name it happened to have at the time. Europe's a separate thing.
All right.
Europe includes, apart from anything else, Russia, a country which will never ever be permitted to join the European Union because it would upset the whole concept. So let's separate Europe from European Union from start. I think we did it because we were demoralized after the Suez catastrophe. We'd made a huge mistake and had been shown up as being a far less important country than we were. We were deeply demoralized. It affected my family directly. It ended pretty much my father's career as a naval officer, because that was the end of a big global navy in this country, and he was one of those people who suffered as a result of that, and many other people did as well. But the country generally felt thoroughly slapped in the face and was looking around for some other way of asserting itself as a medium-sized power. And I think quite a lot of people, particularly in the Conservative Party, thought that the then European community would be a good way of doing it. I think they were mistaken.
But wasn't that a way to secure some kind of future for Britain, demoralised as it was?
Well, it was a way of securing some kind of future. The question, as always, is, was it the right kind of future, and were the better choices available? And apart from anything else, the European Union wasn't inevitable as the way of sorting out Europe's problems. As Christopher Booker describes, and indeed Hugo Young as well in their respective books on the subject, the Great Deception and This Blessed Plot, the whole thing began in a very idealistic concept of supranational institutions, very, very carefully and slowly and cautiously and subtly introduced, rather than what the original Council of Europe was supposed to bring about, which is cooperation among nations. And it's a wholly new thing in the modern world, the idea of real existing sovereign nations giving up that sovereignty to a supranational body, piece by piece, but voluntarily. And it's been a very difficult experiment, and not everybody has done too well out of it.
Why do you think that the Norwegian example is the way to go, and why hasn't it been taken?
Well, it's not too late. There's still a lot of time before we actually get to the point of serious discussions on how this is all going to end.
Well, hasn't Theresa May ruled certain things out that make the Norwegian model impossible?
I used to be an industrial correspondent in the Margaret Thatcher and Jim Callaghan days of incessant strikes. People were always ruling things out, which in the end, at the final negotiations about midnight, they often came around to accepting, and people were too polite to mention that time that they'd ruled them out. I don't believe that the fact that someone's ruled something out necessarily means it won't happen. I'm afraid it's just a belief that I have. Maybe she won't do it. That's a mistake. If so, why am I in favour of it? Because since we are definitely going to leave the European Union, certainly in our present form.
We are definitely, are we? I mean, there's all sorts of talk about, the government will fall and another referendum will be held and things will change.
Now, that I wouldn't rule out, but on the other hand, I think the grave risk for those who call for a second referendum is that it would come up with the same result as the first, and then where would they be? There's no sign that I've seen of any great shift in opinion among the blocks of people who voted as they did.
Really? I mean,
none.
The prevailing wisdom is that the people who voted for Brexit have now seen the error of their ways and would not vote the same way again.
I don't think there's any serious psephological evidence of that. And I think that if it comes, then that may change things. But I simply haven't seen any. I think if there were polls which are saying, look, there's now a reliable majority for remaining, I think it would change the whole political atmosphere. But there have been none, and people are constantly asking. So no, not at the moment. Also, there is the other simple thing here. You do have to obey the rules. If you give sovereignty to the people, and one of the problems about this is we've given sovereignty to the people in two different kinds. We've given it to them through parliamentary supremacy, and now we've given it to them through the supremacy of a referendum, and the two constantly conflict. But if you have said this is a vote we will abide by the majority result, even if it had only been a majority of one. Everybody who is in any way involved in democratic politics is morally obliged, it seems to me, to abide by it. The whole democracy ceases to exist, unwinds, unravels, and turns into a heap of ashes if anybody serious says we're not going to abide by the result of majority vote.
However,
and I think a lot of people understand that,
Yep.
and I think the people in the House of Lords who, for instance, go on about overturning it, they know in their hearts that if they tried to do that, it would be the end of the House of Lords.
but the fact
And
is
it
that
would deepen the constitutional crisis even further than it's already gone. And we do have a slow motion constitutional crisis in the United Kingdom at the moment.
a slow motion constitutional crisis
Yeah,
in the
very
sense
much
of...
so. Yeah. In the sense of we have this incessant clash between the will of the people as expressed in the referendum and the will of the people as expressed in the general election. We have political parties, neither of which are fundamentally in favour of leaving the European Union, both of them obliged by constitutional duty to support measures which will take us out of it. It's a mess.
Well, it's a mess because 48% of the people who voted in the referendum voted to stay in Europe. So you have this huge division in the country.
Well, yeah, but that's always the way with democracy, isn't it? It doesn't matter how many. I'm not actually a terrific enthusiast for universal suffrage democracy. I think it's probably the enemy of liberty, but that's a subject for another time.
I suspect it is, yeah.
But I have to tell you that when I've said this in the past, before recent events, before the election of Donald Trump and before the referendum, all my left-wing hate fans, as I might call them, have snarled at me and said, "What? You don't really believe in democracy? You must be some kind of fascist." Since the election of Donald Trump and the referendum, they've begun to say, "Well, maybe you've got a point. Democracy is not necessarily the best way of coming up with the right answer."
Well, you can't support democracy until it gives you the result you don't like, and then...
No, exactly. I didn't support it before, and I don't support it now. I support liberty. I think the jury trial and the presumption of innocence are much greater protections of human liberty than any number of elections, and I think that liberty is the thing that we really ought to be concerned
Let us
about.
get back to the Norwegian
But as you
model.
say, it's not what you invited me here to talk about.
Let us get back to the Norwegian model, which you have promoted and sponsored and espoused for a long, long time. What is the Norwegian model, and how could Britain do it?
Right, well, you're outside the European Union and you're outside the customs union, so you aren't governed in most areas by the decisions of the European Commission or the European Court of Justice. You're inside, on the other hand, the European Economic Area and the single market. And therefore, a lot of trading is made much easier. You aren't a third country, so you don't have immense customs bureaucracy on every border. And it's the bureaucracy, not the tariffs, which are the real problem.
So you have all the advantages and none
You
of
have
the
a lot of
issues.
advantages. You do have to have, between Norway and Sweden, there are customs posts on the border, but they manage them quite well, and there isn't really any serious difficulty on the border that would actually cause great friction if a similar border existed, say, on the island of Ireland between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic. It would be manageable if anybody wanted it. The main thing about the other thing about it is it does give you, if you take what is called the Liechtenstein exception, which let's not go into in full detail, but the point about it is it does allow you, within the rules of the European Economic Area, to limit immigration, which is crucial, to have some control over your borders. And you can take this off the shelf and plug it in and it will work. There's an existing model of it. We could do it. We could simply apply for that status and get it.
All right, so what's the argument?
There will be all the other things that are on offer involve immensely detailed negotiations, attempts to replicate deals which have taken decades to work out in negotiation, which won't work off the shelf and which may not be ready when the moment comes. And if we haven't got a good arrangement when the moment comes, what happens at the existing frontiers? What happens at the Channel? Do we have lorries parked for miles up the motorways in both directions because stuff can't get in and out because of the new bureaucracy? Does the same thing happen on the Irish border? If you had the Norway option, all that would be removed. You wouldn't have to worry about that. And also, as I say, you would have quite a bit of control. People will say, yes, that a lot of European directives you have to follow. You do have to follow some. But you don't have to follow anything like as many as we do now. There's a lot more freedom, and also you're free to trade with the rest of the world in a way which membership of the customs union doesn't allow you to do.
So what's the argument against the Norwegian model? Why isn't it being taken?
Well, you'd have to ask somebody who was against it.
Well,
I
what do
can't
you think?
myself see any good argument against it, except that most people in Britain don't understand the European issue and never have. And the person who persuaded me of the Norwegian model is Christopher Booker, who, as I say, has written one of the two most authoritative books on the subject, who understands it with his friend Richard North, who understands it better than almost anybody else, and who stands looking aghast at the inability of British politicians before, during and since the referendum to understand the issues on which they're being so vehement. There is a very low level of understanding in British politics and the British media of what the European Union is, of how it works. And I tend to think that that is the reason why people haven't grasped yet. But I say we still could get there. I'm not ruling it out. I've been outside too many last-minute negotiations to give up yet.
What's the Labour Party doing? What's the position it has? I don't quite grasp that.
Well, there are two. You have to understand that there is a very old strand in the Labour Party, and a very honourable one, going back to Tony Benn, who says basically, if I can't sack you, then it's not a democracy. And his attitude towards the European Commission was we couldn't sack them, and therefore they shouldn't be allowed to rule us. And he basically comes from a pretty much 17th century parliamentary tradition of left-wing liberty-loving, and he just didn't like the look of it. And Jeremy Corbyn is of that same tradition. He is a Bennite, really, and he believes that if he wants to pursue seriously left-wing policies in this country, he can't do so if he doesn't have total sovereignty over our government, and if Parliament doesn't rule. And if the European Commission is in charge, Parliament doesn't rule. A lot of the legislation which goes through the British Parliament now is disguised as acts of Parliament, but it is in fact European Commission directives dressed up as acts of Parliament, which we have to pass because we're obliged to as members of the EU. That makes all kinds of policies completely impossible and doesn't really allow British governments to rule independently. Now, if you're a serious radical, as Jeremy Corbyn is, you really don't want to have another government looking over your shoulder telling you what you can and can't do, and that's reasonable. The other part of the Labour Party, the new metropolitan, trendy, bourgeois, bohemian part of the Labour Party, which was really the Blairite part, has a completely different view. They have seen the European Union as the embodiment of the ideals of 1968, of no borders, multicultural, bright future, globalism of the kind that they love. And also they associate it with socially liberal policies, not unreasonably, since it does promote a lot of them. And they object to leaving on those grounds. So there is a fundamental clash in the Labour Party, but there's been that clash for a long time. But this issue has drawn attention to it. Jeremy Corbyn, with just masterly inactivity, just doesn't address it, which, if you look back at politics and history, is not actually a bad position to adopt. If you don't have to, why should you? That's how Kutuzov beat Napoleon in Russia in 1812.
But doesn't he have to?
By just not doing anything.
But doesn't he have to address it? I mean, I know that you've said
eventually, but I think he will try as hard as he can to leave it as late as possible.
I mean, you've said that the Labour Party doesn't stand a chance of winning the 2020 election with Corbyn in charge.
I haven't.
Yeah, you did.
No, I didn't. Where did I say that?
Well, I'm saying
I'm among conservative commentators. I am very rare in saying from the start I thought Jeremy Corbyn could win the Labour Party leadership, and I thought there was a very good argument why he should. I thought it was time we had a proper Labour Party instead of the thing that we had. And when he became leader of the Labour Party, I thought people have underestimated him consistently. I've never ever that I can recall made any such prediction. It's difficult for him to win. It's difficult for anybody to win.
I am reading an account of your participation in Question Time, which was March last year, and it says, while Mr Hitchens agreed that the Labour Party does not stand a chance of winning the 2020 election with Corbyn in charge, he said the party's woes are not the Labour leader's fault.
Oh, well, I can't. I have no recollection of saying that.
All right.
And I'd love to see the direct quotation. My view has not been that Jeremy Corbyn is a disaster for the Labour Party, or that he's not capable of winning. I mean, I don't. It's very difficult for anyone to win an election in Britain at the moment. But I genuinely don't recall thinking that, let alone saying it. And the fact that it's an indirect quotation summary.
It's from the Express.
The Express?
Yes.
Oh, well, there you are then. A paper for which I used to work
Exactly.
until I resigned.
Exactly. What you want for Britain is not necessarily what other people want in terms of exiting from the EU. I mean, you have argued, and forgive me if this also is not in terms of your memory.
Well, you're not reading the Daily Express again.
No.
No, that's okay. Well,
No. But have you not argued that you should have the right to bear arms in Britain?
Not exactly. I mean, we have the right to bear arms, but for anything else, under the Bill of Rights of 1689. Used to be reserved exclusively to Protestants, but that was dropped. So we already have it. No, I've argued that the idea that you can restrict gun crime by making it harder for law-abiding people to own guns is a fundamentally ludicrous argument. That's all. I have no desire to own or possess a gun, but I just think that the arguments used about gun control are fundamentally fatuous
And
don't work.
The death penalty for homicide, bring back the death penalty. So
I think
both
death
of those
penalty
things.
death penalty should definitely be an option that judges should have in the case of heinous murder. Yes.
And it's those kind of things what you regard as Britain's rights having been eroded by the EU.
No. The question of guns, in fact, Britain's gun laws until 1920 made Texas look effeminate, and since then they've been eroded not by anything to do with the European Union, but largely by Roy Jenkins and other Liberal Home Secretaries completely independently. That's not a European issue, and nor was the death penalty a European issue. The Labour government, the Blair government, made it an issue though not directly a European Union issue, by failing to renew a derogation we had from the Human Rights Convention, which allowed us to maintain the death penalty, which we still had in 1948 when the convention was signed, and we had a special exemption, but the Labour Party failed to renew it, so we lost that exemption. But that's not a European Union issue. That's, oddly enough, a Council of Europe issue. But no, neither of those things has anything to do with the European Union as such.
What do you think is the most likely outcome from this point?
I think we will move from having been half in the European Union to being half out of it after a lot of shouting.
Half out of it?
We're half in now, we'll be half out. It won't feel all that much different.
So
Have you ever broken, this is my basic question, have you ever broken a leg or an arm and had it in plaster?
No, actually.
No, well, I did once break my ankle. I had my leg in plaster for some weeks, and the thing which astonished me when the plaster came off was how the muscle had atrophied away on my calf, that it just vanished. And I tend to feel that this is what happens to a country which gives up its self-government, that it atrophies, and our ability to exist as an independent country is much reduced. The great thing about the muscle on my calf was with a bit of bicycling, I got it back. But I don't think Britain is going to recover so easily from the loss of habitual exercise of sovereignty, which began in the 1970s. It doesn't really know how to be a fully independent country anymore. And it also doesn't really have the resources. And the massacre of our manufacturing industry, which followed our membership of the European Union, I still don't know whether it can be attributed to it or not. There are many reasons for it, but I think it played a part in it. Has left us very ill-equipped to become a global trading nation again.
Did you find yourself agreeing with UKIP or deploring UKIP?
Both. I never liked UKIP. I thought it was a Thatcherite party in exile. I didn't like its leader, Nigel Farage, who was more of what I think is called a libertarian than a conservative. For instance, he at one stage advocated the decriminalisation of drugs, which I think is the height of folly. So I didn't like that. I didn't like the rather nostalgic flag waving. I'm not an enthusiast for that. But on the other hand, and also I thought that it was fundamentally a futile organisation because it seemed really dedicated, most of all, to trying to get the Conservative Party to hold a referendum on the European Union, which didn't seem to me to be an object worth having. So not much.
I mean, that nostalgic flag waving that you refer to doesn't seem too far away from your insistence that Britain should have its sovereignty back. Give us our country back.
No, I'm in favour of facts, not of symbols. I'm not particularly interested. I like to see a white ensign flapping from the staff of a warship. That makes me feel pleased because I come from a naval family. But otherwise, I couldn't really care less about flags. They're symbols like national anthems. and airlines of national existence. The real facts of sovereignty are to make your own laws, to enforce your own borders, to run your own economy, and to have your own armed forces that you yourself control. These are the facts of sovereignty, and these are the things which we have been throwing away, and I would like them restored. It's not for me. I'm unmoved by flags.
The flags are what draw people's attention to the argument, however.
Well, they may do so, but I can only speak as I find. This is how it strikes me. This is how it's always struck me from the start. That's what mattered to me. I very strongly disliked finding that laws under which I lived had not been made by the free parliament that I was supposed to be electing.
Meanwhile, the Tory party is in complete disarray, is it not?
That's one of the great compensations.
What, the pleasure of watching it?
I hate the Tory party more than you can possibly imagine.
Why do you?
Because I am a Conservative, and the Tory party is the principal obstacle to conservatism in Britain.
Because?
Well, because it isn't itself conservative. I mean, I used to be a Trotskyist, and I also used to spend a lot of time in communist Eastern Europe, and I sometimes find my sides almost splitting as I observe conservative politicians adopting policies which, when I was a Trotskyist, we would have thought slightly too radical, or particularly on the family and education, policies which were very much the mainstay of communist East Germany in the 1980s. They have no idea what it is to be a conservative, and they also have no idea what it is that they're doing. They've adopted wholesale the principles of Blairism, not understanding that Blairism is in fact Gramscian Eurocommunism.
But this is always the way.
The problem with being a former Marxist-Leninist is that you're given this sort of Cassandra-like vision. You can see what's actually going on, but nobody will believe you.
No, that's right. But the problem is that the Tory party, just like New Labour, had to get into power. And to get into power, you have to have some process of negotiation with the electorate, right? So the Tory party...
So they lied to the electorate with stupid slogans like tough on crime and education, which they didn't mean, while actually preparing a huge programme of social and cultural revolution, of integration in the European Union, and of gigantic, unprecedented public spending, none of which they said they were going to do. So that argument doesn't wash. The other thing is, do you know that 6 members of Blair's cabinet, including Blair, are former Marxist-Leninists who've never ever explained or apologised for or regretted their previous affiliations?
Well,
6 members. 6 members of it. It begins to look like carelessness. I'm sorry, but the whole idea that the Blair government was some kind of moderate construction designed to please the electorate simply doesn't fit the facts.
Can't people change?
They do, yeah, they can.
I mean, you were an atheist once, and now you are
but the thing is,
Christian.
I will talk about it, and if people ask me, I'll explain the change of mind, and I'll admit to the past. You will never get. In fact, I hesitate to name some of those 6 because they might even sue, because I can't prove in a court of law what I know to be the case. But as I say, Blair himself, and this is the astonishing thing that illustrates how uninterested people are in this fascinating fact. Blair himself admitted to this on a BBC Radio 4 programme about 3 or 4 months ago, and it attracted almost no attention from anybody but me. An amazing revelation. A man who was Prime Minister of the country saying, actually, yes, I was a trot. And nobody even noticed because it didn't fit with the conventional wisdom that he was something else, and so nobody bothered to pay any attention to it. And this was extracted from him, oddly enough, by Peter Hennessy, a very respectable person, who got it out of him by brilliantly soft questioning. But it seemed to me to be a huge story, untouched, because conventional wisdom is so uninterested in fascinating truths. But it tells you quite a lot. I was listening once to one of them who's absolutely definitely a former member of the Communist Party. He was a member of the Communist Party at the time when the Soviet government used to leave bundles of £20 notes in plastic bags on Barons Court tube station for agents of the British Communist Party to collect and store in the roof of a man called Reuben Falbo in Golders Green, North London. The Communist Party was actually directly subsidised in used £20 notes by the Soviet government. And John Reed, who became Defence Secretary, was a member of it at the time.
I feel you've got
Isn't
another...
that fascinating?
I feel you've got another book coming out.
Yeah, I have got another book coming out. It's not about that.
What is it
So
about?
I'm happy to go into it any time you like.
Feel free. What is it?
It's called The Phony Victory, and it's about the ridiculous fetishization we make of the Second World War as a good war, when in fact it was how shall I say this, a grey war at best, in which Britain itself lost almost everything, and in which we ended up having rightly not given in to Hitler, handing over half of Europe to Stalin.
What should have been done?
Well, that's a difficult thing.
Yeah.
It's one of those Irish questions, isn't it?
Yes.
I wouldn't have started
You can't get
from
there
here.
from here.
Well, no, you can get there from my starting point. Is this, was September 1939 really a good moment to declare war? And I think the answer to that has to be no, because in September 1939 we didn't have an army. It's a bad moment. You haven't got an army, you declare war on Europe's foremost military power. Seems to me like a bad idea.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't work out very well either. I mean, within less than a year, we were on our uppers and begging the United States for anything we could get out of them.
It all worked out in the end, though.
Well, it worked out in the end, but it worked out in the end with pretty much the breakup of the British Empire and the huge diminution of the power and influence of Britain and our absorption into a European superstate.
You see,
So it doesn't seem to me to be much of a victory.
I was interviewing somebody last week whose case was that it is the grief about the loss of the empire and the absence of any clear identity for England that makes people rush to vote for Brexit. It's some kind of pathetic last gasp of a diminished country.
There's something of that, but I don't think you should be so cruel to it. It is a very hard thing to have grown up in a country which was great and recognise that it is great no longer.
Well, get over it. I mean, everybody else has to put up with that.
Well,
how do you think Greece feels? How do you think Egypt feels?
Well, they felt for a long time that they were under the occupation of foreign armies, which didn't happen to us. You see, and this is the significant thing. We have this complete split. Things happen to us which normally happen to defeated and occupied countries, but we were never defeated or occupied. And that's the thing. My father, who fought in the Second World War, used to say sometimes on grumpy evenings, "Well, we won the war, or did we?" And it's partly to answer his question that I've written the book. We technically were on the winning side, but in the years after it, the country in which he found himself and in which I grew up a few years later than that looked pretty much like a country that had been defeated. It was pretty bad, and so there is a difficulty there. But no, I think there were three strands in the movement to leave the European Union. One was people like me who weren't actually very politically significant. One was people who want, as a global open borders, free trade, Britain, and see the EU as an obstacle to that. And the other were the Labour voters who had long wanted to protest against and put a stop to mass immigration, but whose own party would never let them. And people vote tribally at general elections. So Labour voters would always vote loyally for Labour, even though they knew that Labour would do nothing about mass immigration. But the moment they were off the party leash, they all voted in their millions to leave. And that was what swung it. That was absolutely the thing that swung it. It wasn't the old UKIP people with their flags, and it wasn't the globalisers either. It was the Labour voters who were sick and tired of mass immigration changing the world in which they lived with no benefit to them that they could see and not being able to do anything about it, and they voted to put a stop to it. And that is what fundamentally led to the result that we had.
We're nearly out of time. I just wanted to ask you...
Sorry about that.
No. I just wanted to ask you your take on Boris Johnson, who looked like the dog that had caught the car and then didn't know what to do with it when the results of the referendum came in.
I think there's a lot in that. I don't think they were expected to win. I think they underestimated, as most people did, the strength of the Labour vote that was going to go in favour of leave. I think they simply did not get it that was going to happen. And they had hoped to make a political point and advance their political careers, and they got a result they didn't expect. But I can't prove that. I like Boris Johnson as a person. I mean, my dealings with him in the world of journalism have been nothing but delightful, and I know lots of people who like him as well. But I don't think he's hugely burdened with principles. I think he's entertaining. and I think he's witty, and I think he thinks very quickly. But if you want somebody who's very principled and who can absolutely be relied to say what he's going to do and then do it, then I think you probably need to turn somewhere else. But it may well be that the British people looking around at what's on offer to them might look and say, well, actually, this Johnson chap, at least he offers us something that might cheer us up.
Yep, that's Peter Hitchens. I was talking to him earlier this morning. I know, it's uncanny how similar to his late brother, Christopher.
We will make America great again.